Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on Talking Point, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of our YouTube subscribers who've taken us to that 100,000 mark that we are looking at. We thank you for your support and your engagement. Our experts today join us from New York. Professor Rajan Menon is the director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities. He's a Spitzer Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the City College of New York. He's also a senior research fellow at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. And he's also a co-author of a book he wrote in 2015, Ukrainian Conflict, The Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order. Professor Menon, thank you for giving us time so early in the morning.
Hello, Amitabh. How are you?
Great. Other guest joins us from Washington. Richard Rossow has been on StratNews Global before, senior fellow and Wadhwani chair in U.S.-India policy studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Rossow, I believe you were up and early going for a jog around the White House, so you can't blame me for waking you.
Beautiful morning for it.
Professor Menon, I know we just get into the implications of sanctions and your views on that, but before, even though it is probably already too late in terms of U.S.-Russia relations, but you've been writing about it since at least 2015, if not earlier, about the need to recognize Russia's security concerns and how this could have been avoided. If you want to just expand on that a little bit.
So the debate here, excuse me, is about two things. What role did NATO expansion play? And whether NATO expansion is at all important, and whether this is all about Mr. Putin's fear of a democratic Ukraine. And I think it's a combination of both. But I think there's no doubt that NATO expansion contributed to this. The Russian leadership has been opposed to this from the beginning of NATO expansion as a concept to 1999 when it began, and certainly since President Putin became president in 2000. It's true that the NATO alliance had no immediate plans to admit Ukraine, but I think there was a Russian fear. Now, that said, I don't think that justifies a full-on assault against a sovereign country, but the context for this is certainly NATO expansion in part.
Mr. Rossow, President Zelensky has said he's cold, Ukraine is cold towards NATO. NATO, of course, that whole process would take a lot longer. The EU is maybe another question. But is there anything, as the Americans say, in the current situation, off-ramps? Or are we going to see this death and destruction, at least in the short term?
Lots of potential off-ramps, but I think it's anybody's guess. I think the best experts that I know on Russia, the days leading up, most of them, I think, would have assumed that there wouldn't be the invasion itself. So when we talk about off-ramps, still a lot of guesswork, but we know what they would probably look like. A ceasefire, Russia controlling parts of the country, backing off of others, Russia leveling the country and trying to stand over the ruins, something happening in Moscow where Putin is dislodged because of unhappiness. So lots of potential ways that this could play out. But I think as we saw with people's expectations that there would not be the invasion, which I think was widely held, I don't know that we all know exactly what's in President Putin's mind right now.
Professor Menon, now the unprecedented severity of sanctions and the unprecedented nature of US, West, NATO, EU, Japan, Australia, other countries like Singapore, in terms of imposing those sanctions or costs on Russia. One, the impact for the Russians itself, because President Putin would have probably gamed them already. And two, the domestic blowback in terms of either politics or economics, whether it's for President Biden or any other country for that matter.
So before I answer that, just very quickly, I don't see any off-ramps at all at this point. I think the Russians are determined to push this campaign forward. This morning, we woke up to the news that they've expanded military operations, at least airstrikes, to two cities, one Lutsk, not far from the Polish border in the northwest, and the other Ivano-Frankivsk. And that's probably a preemptive move to try to seal off parts of Western Ukraine to prevent arms shipments from Poland. Now, on the economic sanctions, they have been severe. There are shortages. The ruble has tumbled. There are foreign currency restrictions about money that can leave the country. Prices have increased. But so far, there is no sign that although the average Russian has been hurt significantly, and the Russians cannot prop up the ruble because about 50% of the Russian central bank's reserves in dollars are outside the country and blocked, there's no sense that despite some sporadic demonstrations that the government has come up against yet a protest movement that it cannot block. It has substantial coercive powers at its disposal. I've no doubt that it will use it if need be. I don't see any sign that Putin, despite the sanctions, is looking for a way out of this.
Right. Mr. Rossow, if you want to take the same question in terms of both the repercussions in Russia, which we haven't seen much of, but more so in the US with the midterm elections coming up, with possibility of the House and the Senate moving across, and in each country having their issues.
Well, clearly, I think when you see the Biden administration moving even further and looking at impacting Russia's oil and gas sectors, they picked up the signals that across the United States, there's generally support for intervening, at least through sanctions, as well as indirect military support in the conflict in Ukraine. It would have been very difficult with midterms coming up for any Democratic elected leader trying to retain office and have some level of authority to take steps on energy. They're going to increase prices at the pump for most Americans. So it seems that trying to assist Ukraine in this effort has been building up widespread support, but certainly, the moral reasons behind it are very strong and powerful. And the administration was hoping from the get-go. I think a lot of us weren't quite sure that the Western reaction would be quite as strong and concerted as it has been. And so I think so far, you do see, and probably to Putin's surprise to some extent, that it has galvanized pushback from a lot of countries that hadn't been seeing eye to eye in recent years. So that might have been a bit of a miscalculation, I think, on Russia's side here. But I agree that so far you're not really seeing much interest in breaking, though.
Amitabh, can I add a word quickly on sanctions? We know
Please.
a lot about the history of sanctions, and to summarize the literature, it is as follows: sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But when a country has priced in some of the consequences and is determined to pursue an action that, for whatever reason, it deems extremely important, it will undergo substantial pain. So the idea that states are just economic calculators like accountants with green eye shades, I think misses the point that they fight or operate for all kinds of other reasons: insecurity, prestige, status, and so on. So the record of sanctions working here is mixed. The problem is that even if they work, it will not save Ukraine from what is now becoming a scaled up, highly punitive war. 2 million refugees have left the country, 800,000 displaced, about $900 million in assets destroyed so far. It will take Ukraine a very long time to come out from under this. What I don't understand is what Mr. Putin's endgame is here.
Mr. Rossow, if you want to talk about blowback in terms of how long can the impact, which is impacting the countries that are imposing these sanctions, for example, $4 a gallon for gas in the US, how long can that price be paid, and especially politically, if, like I said, there will be midterm elections coming up?
Well, doing it so close, I think when we're talking just 6 months ahead of the midterm elections, it does feel like they've already taken into consideration the midterm elections, knowing that there's going to be, even if oil prices come down, even if gas prices at the pump come down by then, there's going to be that reminder and shock that this intervention, really did to some extent contribute to that. And whether the Biden administration decides to reopen some of the areas of the United States that we'd held off on our own exploration and development kind of remains to be seen. But, as we've seen in past conflicts, the American public can hold attention for a certain period of time and not too much longer. And so I suspect, we've kind of got to calculate the political calculation through the midterms. But after that, it's difficult to imagine, taking these kind of steps that would continue oil prices at a high level for much beyond that, I would think.
Professor Menon, do you want to take that?
Yes, I agree with Richard, but it goes well beyond oil. So Ukraine and Russia account for about 25% of all wheat exports. Ukraine is a major exporter of corn. Those prices have soared. Container shipping rates and shipping rates for tankers or fuel tankers have gone up substantially. Those costs will be passed on to the consumer. Metal prices have gone up. This will have an effect on Western growth rates. Already yesterday, Goldman Sachs downgraded its growth projections for the EU. It's expected to push inflation up here. Richard will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think our inflation rate now is the highest it's been in some decades. And so the question is, as the midterms come around, will the American public say, well, this is all Putin's fault, or will it at some point hold the government accountable? The Republicans, I'm sure, will do everything possible at some point to say that this is mismanagement by the Biden administration. Will the war end by then? I don't know.
I just want to go to your assessment, Mr. Rossow, of the impact on India's economy. And I've seen a few shows that you've been doing of late, looking at the overall picture coming out of COVID, recovery of sorts, and now this. What's your overall economic impact assessment on the Indian economy, Mr. Rossow?
Well, the Indian economy is still very sensitive to the price of oil, a little bit less to the price of other metals and commodities. But, it's true that as prices of all things begin to rise, as manufacturing costs begin to go up, India's going to feel the pinch. India already has a massive import bill, which triggers a lot of policy making from Delhi, trying to, local source a lot of things that the country imports. Oil, that's been so far very difficult to do, even with dramatic expansion in the amount of acreage under exploration in India. So I see mostly downside, but there are some, potential bright spots. For instance, you have seen Eastern Europe be one of the competing markets against India for things like IT services. And because of instability in Europe, you may see some of that work come back to India in a little bigger way. So could be some potential small bright spots, but I see more downside risk, at least in the near midterm.
Professor Menon, your assessment?
Well, I'm not an expert on India like Richard is, but there's one thing that bears watching, and that is when India takes delivery of the S-400, which is a very sophisticated Russian air defense system, will it trigger the CAATSA sanctions? I don't know whether it will or not, but people are certainly raising that issue here. One could argue that Modi's India is seen as a kind of a budding strategic partner. On the other hand, India abstained from the resolution. It is a very significant military purchaser of Russian equipment, and I don't know how this will play out. So far as I know, CAATSA hasn't been raised and put on the front burner because there are too many other things going on, but it's something to keep your eye on.
Absolutely. I'll just get both your thoughts on that a little bit more and India-specific questions. But I just want to take in one of our regular viewers, an American who's in Australia, a professor, a writer, an author. He's come on our shows before, Salvador Barbones, and thanks for the Australian $10 question there. Professor Menon, is there a nuclear danger in destabilizing Russia through perhaps too effective economic sanctions, is what he asks?
I don't think the economic sanctions will destabilize Putin's government based on what I know now. Now, it's worth repeating here what Richard said at the outset. Nobody expected this war, and this has been a war of surprises. But what worries me here is there are some people who have called for regime change. Now, trying to attempt that in the world's only other nuclear superpower strikes me as a big gamble unless you are absolutely certain that one of two things will occur: a stable authoritarian successor to Putin who withdraws from Ukraine, or a democratic Russia. You have to be able to rule out the third option, which is violence and fragmentation in Russia. So I think this is a very dangerous policy advocacy. The Biden administration has said that it does not support it, but there are people here calling for it.
If you want to take that, Mr. Rossow, also just want to put in some other, it wasn't just oil, both of you mentioned that. I mean, there's talk of famine because of wheat in Africa. Another question which comes in from Rishikiran Devjyoti: what will happen to high-tech industries in the US after Russia bans titanium and other rare metals, Mr. Rossow?
Well, already just because of China's ability to dominate flows of precious metals that are used for technology and other things, there's been an aggressive push driven to some extent by government and, of course, a large extent by private sector to look for new sources of metals. I think that'll be expedited. So you may see a near short-term pinch, but there are deposits, and so it is possible to go to other places, but it's going to take time. You've got to make sure that you're accommodating any concerns about ecological damage in places where you're going to find additional resources. You've got to make sure that there's infrastructure to be able to get it to ports for shipping and transportation networks and things. But much of that process has already begun for a very different reason, of course, the concerns about China's ability to dominate the trade of certain precious metals and such. So I think this will really kind of double down and augment everybody's interest in making sure that happens.
Professor Menon, you mentioned CATSA, and I'll get your thoughts a little bit more, flesh them out from both of you. But how do you see India's legacy dependency on Russian arms and military supplies, especially in light of what's happening vis-a-vis China? Where do you go? I mean, I've read Dhruv Jaishankar writing recently that it's India's 1991 economic moment in the military terms, in terms of pivoting away.
So just before I answer that very quickly, in addition to the increase in prices of a lot of things, from metals to wheat to energy, there has also been a further disruption of the global supply chains, which were already made bad by the pandemic. Now, on the Indian-Russian arms relationship, two things. The Indian arms market is open to international competition in a way that it has not been in my memory. The Russians, the Soviets / the Russians had a lock on it. Now, because the Indian force structure is still composed of either imported Russian Soviet equipment or equipment made under license, this cannot happen very quickly. And I think one of the reasons why India has treaded lightly on the Russia-Ukraine war and not jumped in to condemn Russia is that there's a lot at stake for the Indian government. You do have Western armament companies, Israeli armament companies operating in the Indian market and eyeing it as a potential market. But there's a legacy problem with Russian equipment that cannot be overcome quickly.
I just wanted to go back to the CATSA question, Mr. Rossow. There were indications coming out of the administration, at least, that the Biden administration understood the position that India was in. And with China being the bigger threat for countries around the world, there would probably be a waiver. But then there is Congress, and then there is the invasion. Do you see anything changing in Washington because of what's been happening?
Yeah, it's a cloudy situation at best. I think before the invasion, I think we had a narrow pathway that seemed more likely than not that a waiver would be granted. But now, there is a disappointment in large sectors of the U.S. security establishment that would like to see India. They talk about, shared values and democracy, things like that, and they would like to see India take a harder position. I think those that are in the trenches, that are working day and night to try to create a stronger defense posture vis-a-vis the dangerous elements of the rise of China, that's the group that's willing to give a little bit more leeway for India on this and would look for a pathway through. There is, of course, a waiver authority that's included in the legislation. It's very narrow, and it's got language on things like, is the country supporting America's security interests globally? And those are the areas that I think have pinched a little bit more sharply closed because of this invasion and because of the perception that India hasn't really taken a stronger stance. India is in a campaign here, certainly the Indian government, to try to sell its own message more broadly in Washington. Whether that'll resonate is tough to see because we are just probably a few months away from when India will have the S-400s deployed and testing, and that was the trigger point for Turkey. So it looks like we're just a few months away from decision time. So this invasion, in that sense, couldn't have happened at a worse time.
Well, one squadron has been deployed, I believe, in Punjab. You're right that the rest of the four. But then what happens if the S-500s that India goes in for, and what happens to the SSN, the nuclear submarine? Just want to get, Professor, your comments on, again, what Salvatore is saying. I don't see why India should stop buying Russian arms until Europe stops buying Russian gas. Money is money. It doesn't matter what source it comes from.
Well, he has a point. I mean, the idea that countries that have very significant national interests and entanglements with Russia should be heedless to the national security implications of throwing all that overboard and line up with the Western position on Ukraine, I think is a bit much. It's not only India, by the way. So, another country that the United States is even closer to, Israel, while it voted for the General Assembly resolution, has been walking a very fine line. Indonesia, Bangladesh, South Africa. So if you look China, if you look at it in population terms, a very significant section of humanity has chosen not to really line up in the way that the United States would like. On the question of CATSA, I think there will be a debate in the corridors of power in Washington about the short term, whether to punish India in the short term versus what the long term effect will be. And the question is whether the strategic thinkers who argue that we should play in the US the long game, win out, will decide what happens.
Right. Just getting in some more questions as they come in for both our panelists. In terms of the Russia-China relationship, Mr. Rossow, how do you see what's happening? Russia being pushed into China's corner even more reliant, whether it's politically, economically, diplomatically, maybe even militarily. How do you see that panning out in terms of the larger Indo-Pacific issue of containing China, the Quad?
Well, I think it has generated, renewed interest and concern about this topic, which had kind of been hanging on the sidelines in Washington for quite some time. I think those that look at it as kind of a near-term condominium, a partnership of aligned interest, which is fighting against a structure for security in the region that neither country really kind of has bought into. At the same time, when you look at it more longer term, and some, I would say it's certainly the minority in Washington, but some do think longer term, and there's likely to be more serious divisions and splits between those two, as time goes on. It may be decades away, but it's unlikely to see that either country is going to look at the other as its superior, and what can the two possibly work on together that would effectively suit both interests. So short-term increased concern, long-term, still wondering how long can the relationship last when it's based on a foundation simply of fighting the rest of the world.
Professor Menon, if you want to talk about that, and then I'll take another question that a viewer had for you.
Just to go back to Professor Barbonis's observation about, well, Europe should stop buying gas if India is expected to not take delivery of the S-400. He's right, except for one thing. There is no equivalent of CATSA that applies to European energy exports.
Gas.
Right, yes. So there's a legislative problem here that has to be overcome in terms of CATSA. Can India get a waiver or not? And I just don't know enough about this to tell you what will happen. And I'm not sure that anybody can predict. So there is some similarity between the European gas imports and the S-400, but CATSA is the thing that makes it complicated and different.
Sure. This is a question, again, I'm addressing to you, Professor Menon, Rishikaran, Devjyoti. Is the US willing to provide cutting-edge military hardware to India to wean off India from Russian equipment? The US has been reluctant to do so in the past. There's also, of course, India's import restrictions and the Make in India initiative. So how does all that come together?
My impression about the conversation about India in Washington is that it's less about the narrow goal of weaning India away from Russia, although there are people who would like to do that. It's much more the view that India is a large emerging power that can, for reasons of its own self-interest, form some kind of a coalition with the United States to balance the country that's the real pure competitor. It's not Russia, but China. So the Russia thing, reducing India's reliance on Russia, is an important consideration, but for the strategic thinkers down the line, the eye is on China and the role that India can play there.
One for you, Mr. Rossow, from Omkar Datpe. Can other nations, China, India, Turkey, compensate Russia's loss of the European oil market? There's some reports suggesting that a heavily discounted price has been offered to countries like India.
Well, India so far, I think, is at least on oil, has really been comfortable. I shouldn't say comfortable, it's an overstatement, but they have accommodated the United States and others' interest in drawing down oil imports from Iran and Venezuela. So, oil you've seen just because there are other markets and not quite the same historical, et cetera, that India has been willing, to bend the pressure that we've seen in hydrocarbons in the past. The question is, is the United States going to try to offer itself up as the next best provider as well? Because which has been across the range of hydrocarbons, gas, oil, as well as coal. Then that starts to look a little bit self-interested. Uncle Sam, basically trying to force India's hand to draw down buying from Russia in exchange for buying from the United States. So I'd be a little bit concerned about that. But, other countries, China in particular, may care a whole lot less about what the world thinks and if they can find prices that are accommodating. But, the question is, how do they get it there? The routes may not be quite so easy.
Professor Menon, again, your assessment of if this goes on for a while longer, and it doesn't seem like there's any off-ramp, as you said, though Mr. Rossow thought there were many. The impact on India's economy in terms of when you're talking about sanctions being imposed on Russia, whatever we get from them in large quantities, apart from military hardware, of course.
Yeah, I'm going to kick this question to Richard because I'm not an expert on India, so I'm loath to talk about this.
Sure, Mr. Rossow.
Well, so overall, I think that the world has been looking for additional markets. You do see overall a big change in where trade flows are kind of moving to right now. India is hoping to get a larger share of production, manufacturing. You see some drawdown from China, for instance, and some of that initially has went to Vietnam, to Malaysia. But even on defense equipment, you see India recently, the Ministry of Defense, looking to insource production of a lot of defense material that otherwise they were looking to buy from outside. The production-linked incentive schemes. So I think you see a lot of drivers right now for India to further kind of insulate itself against international economic wobbliness by producing not just defense material, which has always kind of been there, but on energy with the attempts to develop more self-sufficiency through renewable energy and such. So there's a lot of steps that are going on right now, I think, to insulate that, if they've been started a bit earlier, would offer a bit more protection. But I think better late than never. But then, of course, you do, with some of India's own trade restrictions that have come up, you do see some pressure from the United States and other markets as well to draw that down. So a lot of conflicting things right now in terms of how the linkages are going to impact the Indian economy, I think, in a significant way.
Professor Menon, as you pointed out, if Vladimir Putin has an objective, he would have known, maybe not, known the entire gamut of sanctions that he would be facing, but the alternatives that they have in terms of either SWIFT or what I'm asking is, how long can the Russian economy be badly hit? Like Salvatore thinks, actually, the damage is being underestimated of the Russian economy.
Right. So a couple of things. The Russian banking system in its entirety has not been cut off from SWIFT. What has happened is that 7 banks have been cut off from SWIFT. And the energy sector, because of European pleading, has not been cut off. As you know, Europe gets about 40% of its gas from Russia. But what a lot of people don't know is that Russia is also the largest oil supplier. It's very difficult for the Europeans to come up with an alternative because we're talking in total about between 180 to 200 billion cubic meters of gas. That's a lot. There isn't enough spare supply in the market to suddenly divert supplies to fill that gap in Europe, not from the United States, not from any producer of natural gas. The Europeans have to be very careful. Now, it is said that as the weather warms up, they will need to import less. That's true, but whatever they import, they will still need.
Sure. Just again, while we are on the topic of India, Professor Menon, if you want to share on the rupee-ruble agreement, the arrangement, so to speak, I mean, can that be used to circumvent the sanctions? And if that does really happen, then what is the political or geopolitical fallout that India may face?
So Russia has some workarounds. It's relied to some degree on the Chinese equivalent of SWIFT. It's called CIPS, the Chinese response to SWIFT. With the BRICS countries, it has tried to move toward de-dollarization in trade. But insofar as trade with Japan, South Korea, Western Europe, and the United States is concerned, the hit will be very heavy. This morning, there is discussion in the United States about raising tariffs on Russian imports to punish it even further. So there's no question that the economic squeeze on Russia is going to be very, very tough and could get tougher. The question, though, is what is the purpose? If the purpose is to end the war and to have Vladimir Putin withdraw his troops from Russia, I'm very skeptical that that will happen.
Right. Excuse me, Mr. Ross. I just wanted to get a quick comment. Of course, it's been happening for a long time in terms of India's trade deals, whether it was with the UAE, which we recently signed, UK, Israel, EU, Canada, Australia. Uh, can that kind of ameliorate any overall damage that the Indian economy faces?
I don't think so. They're still
No.
moving along relatively slowly. You did see the announcement of the conclusion of the UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, but I don't think the UAE is going to come in and fill the gaps necessarily that India would face, because of at various market conditions. You look at some of the other markets where India is talking to regularly right now about concluding long pending agreements, Europe, the UK, Canada, Australia, and they still have quite a distance to go. So I don't think any of these are poised and close enough to be stopgap fillers to offset any economic damage that might happen because of global instability and minerals and oil and such. So long-term play is certainly good. Short-term, I don't think you're going to see any real impact on the Indian economy.
Professor Menon, if you want to wrap up, you started off by saying you don't know what Vladimir Putin's end game is, but it doesn't look very good for Ukraine as we know it.
No, very quickly, the situation on the ground now is they have another northern city, Chernihiv, under
Mm.
siege. They're moving at least airstrikes to Lutsk in the west and Ivano-Frankivsk, sort of not quite that far west, but west enough, shall we say. And then they've made huge gains on the Black Sea coast. I think they are trying to make Ukraine a landlocked country. Finally, there are big Ukrainian forces east of a city called Dnipro, which is in the south central, between Dnipro and Donbass. The objective is to encircle and destroy that army. If they succeed, that will be a very big blow for the Ukrainians. Ultimately, the logic of the balance of power and the substantial might that the Russians wield will force some kind of agreement upon the Ukrainians, assuming that some political upheaval does not occur in Russia. The question is, what is the price that will be paid by the Ukrainians to achieve, to prevent further destruction? And what are they prepared to do? And what can President Zelensky do given his domestic political constraints?
Mr. Rossow, your last thoughts in the price that not only Ukraine and Russia are going to pay, but the rest of the world, and if you want to talk about India and the US.
Well, we do have a couple of important bilaterals or multilaterals that are coming up. We should have the U.S.-India 2+2 dialogue that brings together our defense and foreign ministries. And then hopefully not long after that, maybe April or May, we'll have a Quad Leaders Summit that's expected to take place in Japan. So both between these countries trying to balance the Pacific threats that we look at, but also accommodating, giving India a little bit more space in its relationship with Russia. Having these kind of senior level meetings, I think, is going to be pretty important because, as Dr. Menon rightly pointed out, the CATSA waiver decision is the single most significant thing on the table for the coming months. That's going to determine at least the next handful of years in the trajectory of U.S.-India defense and security relations. So it's good that we got these things teed up well ahead of time. They're on track to take place, and that gives leaders an opportunity to kind of sharpen thinking and make sure that we don't take any missteps that are going to be more damaging for regional security in the long term.
Mr. Rossow, I absolutely appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you for coming on StratNews Global.
Yeah.
And Professor Menon, thank you for waking up early and sharing your expertise and your experience here. Again, it was a pleasure as usual.
Thank you, Amitabh. It's always good to talk to you.
And to all our viewers there, each one of you who have helped us get towards that 100,000 subscriber mark, we are hoping to go much further. This is the Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.